It's time to jump into Photoshop, and I gotta say, I'm pretty excited to be teaching you this because, like I've told you before, Photoshop was the first piece of Adobe software that I ever learned. I've been using it for years and years. I love the software, and there are a lot of similarities between it and Illustrator, but there are also some kind of little differences and behavioral differences between the two pieces of programs that might be a little bit confusing and might make this transition from week 1 to week 2 a little bit difficult. I don't want you to get frustrated though. I'm going to walk you through the whole process and we'll tackle this together. So first thing I need to do is open up Photoshop. So I'm going to go into my Creative Cloud, click on Open, and let this open up. Now, like I said, Photoshop is a raster-based or pixel-based program, whereas Illustrator was vector. So the setup process of a document is a little bit more important that you know exactly what you're doing right from the get-go, because changing that size, the resolution of your document after the fact, after you've made a bunch of things, could be difficult and make things really complicated. And I'll explain why in a little bit. But first thing I need to do is create a new document. What I'm going to be working on today is a style frame for a hair product. If you don't know what a style frame is, it's basically an image that gives the client an idea of what the specific piece that you're working on is going to look like in the end. A lot of times designers will give multiple style frames to have different looks for the same product in the pre-production phase when you're dealing with what the actual piece is going to look like. So it's kind of like a glimpse into a possibility of where you could take this piece before it's animated, before it's a video at all for the client to see. They're just still frames so that the client can get an idea of what you're thinking. I'm just going to focus on one style frame for this one product today, and I want to be working at 1920 by 1080, that same HD resolution that we've been working on in Illustrator. And wouldn't you know it, there is a web profile under our presets in Photoshop, just like in Illustrator. This window probably looks pretty familiar compared to what we had inside of Illustrator. Under here we have a web large preset. It's named exactly the same, and that's what I want to work with. Now there is a film and video tab just like in Illustrator, but again, that adds a lot of extra details that I don't really need in my document. So I'm going to stick to web large, and then I'm going to come over to the details of that document setup. We see the width and height, 1920 by 1080, our orientation, and then we have the artboards checkbox. Photoshop can have artboards just like Illustrator. This is not something that Photoshop has always had, but Adobe has adopted that into the Photoshop software, and I think it's a really great feature. I want to leave that checked just in case I need multiple artboards. Our resolution is set to 72 pixels per inch. Now we touched on this a little bit already, but this is something that's important to start understanding. 72 pixels per inch is the number of pixels in an inch of screen real estate. The screen that you're watching this video on right now is more than likely a 72 pixel per inch display. You can get higher resolution displays. Apple Retina displays are higher, but the vast majority of screens are 72 ppi. And when we're working for video and for motion graphics specifically, we're always going to be designing in this 72 ppi or pixels per inch. Higher resolutions like 150 and 300 are for more of the print world. So a lot of newspapers are printed at 150 pixels per inch. And in the actual physical world, the print world, that's actually translated to dots per inch because there's not pixels in the physical world. They're dots of ink being put onto paper. 300 dpi, dots per inch, is very common for photography, and you can even get into much higher dpi images in the print world. We're sticking to the digital web world, so we're going to stay at 72 ppi, but keep that in mind. Our color mode is RGB. That's very important. Over here, this says 8 bits. We also have 16 and 32 bits, but we are not going to be getting into that right now. 8 bits is just fine. And then we have our background contents. Now, this is just the display of our artboard background. Remember in Illustrator, it's by default white. Well, in Photoshop, you can customize that from white to black to the background color, which you'll see in a second what that means. Have it be transparent, or even make a custom color. You could make it whatever you want using the color picker. I want to just leave it as white for now, and then maybe I'll make it transparent later on. We can always adjust that later on. And down here we have advanced options. Now, without getting into too much detail, we need to look at this color profile. Right now it's set to don't color manage. I'm not going to get into all the specifics of what exactly this means, but I do want you to change this setting from don't color manage to this one right down here, sRGB, and then this long code. Don't worry about anything else in this list. Just make sure you select sRGB and then all these numbers and letters. With that selected, we've set up our document exactly how we need to, and I'm going to click on Create. Here's my new document, and if your Photoshop doesn't look like this, make sure you come up to the top right panel, this little drop-down arrow. These are your workspaces. Make sure you have Essentials checked, and if it still doesn't look the same, say Reset Essentials. So I'm going to click that now. Now our screen should look exactly the same. And the first thing I want to do is clean up my workspace a little, because this giant real estate hog over here, this tab called Learn, we don't need that. You're learning from me, so I'm going to close that out. I'm going to right-click on that tab and say Close. And then I want to close this Libraries tab as well. These are your Creative Cloud Library assets. I don't need this open, so I'm going to right-click it and say Close. And now I have much more real estate for my document here. So just taking a look at Photoshop for a second, like I said, the layout is pretty similar to what Illustrator was. We have our toolbar over here on the side. We have some controls up here on the top. We've got a color panel here, even a swatches panel, very similar to Illustrator. We have a properties panel. This is very similar to the way that Illustrator handles it, and we are going to be using that a lot. We've got our layers palette, which it's stacked down here at the bottom. I'm going to leave that right where it is, and then a couple of other panels, which we're not going to get to right now. But overall, the user interface follows the same basic layout as Illustrator, and obviously all of this is customizable. You can drag panels around, open them and close them, finding more panels under the Window tab. But as far as the two programs go, the interface itself is very similar. And a lot of the tools behave the same way inside of Photoshop as they do in Illustrator too. So getting around your document, just navigating, almost all the keyboard shortcuts are the same. If you come up to this Move tool right here, this very closely translates to the Selection tool inside of Illustrator. It has 4 arrows on its icon instead of just the one, but if I move my mouse out over here, you see that I have the normal cursor with that tool's icon on it. With that selected, I can hold down the space bar, and you see that temporarily switches to the hand tool, and I can pan around my document just like in Illustrator. If I press Z on the keyboard, it switches to the magnifying glass, the zoom tool just the same. I can zoom in and out with my scrubby zoom. If yours isn't doing that, just come up to your controls right here, that checkbox, scrubby zoom is right there. So I can zoom in and out and then hold down spacebar at any point to pan around just like inside of Illustrator. One thing that Photoshop handles a little bit differently than Illustrator is the layers structure. So if we take a look at the layers palette, we can see what we have so far. It's an empty document with a white background, but remember that is just a display of our artboard. If I click on that background, my properties panel automatically opens up some of the properties for that artboard. So the artboard background color is white, but I could make that transparent. And there you go, we've got that same checkerboard pattern representing transparency in the background. And I can see that artboard down here in my layers palette. It's actually showing up kind of like a layer, and it has this little drop-down arrow. So I can collapse that or expand it just by clicking on the arrow. That's kind of how groups work inside of Illustrator layers. Inside that artboard, I have layer 1 and this little thumbnail preview showing me the contents of that layer. It's that same checkerboard pattern, so it's letting me know this is an empty layer. There's nothing in it. Now in Illustrator, every time you make a new object, those objects show up in your layers palette as separate objects. But in Photoshop, you can put as much as you want on one single layer. The thing is that you're not always going to be able to separate those objects after you've put them on. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I zoom in nice and close, really close here, and change my background to be black instead of transparent, you see this pixel grid is showing up, just like it did inside of Illustrator. Now it's really faint, so I'm going to change the black to another color and just make this something brighter. There we go. Now you can see that pixel grid. You can think of pixel-based layers inside of Photoshop kind of like painting or drawing on paper or canvas, but instead of using paint or ink or lead pencils, you're going to be using pixels. So if I back out here and zoom to 100% by pressing Command 1, that's a very handy keyboard shortcut. Command 1 is 100% zoom, Command 0 is zoom to fit. So that just kind of centers up my document, and I'll press Command minus once to zoom out a little bit. Let's start with something really basic, like just some very geometric shapes, like squares and circles. But instead of using shape layers and vector graphics, we're going to be using pixels. There are lots of different ways of making pixel-based graphics inside of Photoshop, but one of the most simple ways is just to make a selection, the shape that you want it, and then fill it with whatever color you'd like. So I'm going to come to this tool right here. Underneath the Move tool is a tool called the Rectangular Marquee tool. If I click on that, that gives me a little crosshair inside of my document, and I can click and drag to make a selection. And I've got this pattern moving around. I'm going to hold Shift to snap that to be a perfect square, just like in Illustrator when you're drawing a shape. And then I'm going to hold down Spacebar at the same time to reposition that. So all these keyboard shortcuts translate over into Photoshop, which makes this transition a lot easier. The whole workflow between the two programs is very similar in that way. I also have these little magenta lines showing up. These are my smart guides. I have those enabled as well. So right there, I have it right in the middle of my document. So I'll let go of my mouse and then let go of the keyboard. And I have a perfect square right in the center of my document. If you don't have your smart guides on, just remember to come up to View, and actually, Smart Guides is not showing up. Now, this is a problem that comes up more often than you'd think. Even with somebody experienced who's been using this program for years, sometimes I cannot remember where certain features are enabled or disabled, which panels are where. And that's just the way it is. With Photoshop being such an old program that's been expanded so many times, tools are added, rearranged, sometimes taken away, and you just kind of have to figure out where these things are. But at least on a Mac, there is a way to find these tools very easily. So I'm not sure where Smart Guides are located. So I'm going to come over to the Help, and under Search, this is going to search the menus of this program. So I'm going to search Smart Guide, and right there, menu item, show Smart Guide. That's going to show me exactly where to find that. So if you don't have Smart Guides enabled, come up to View, Show, and then Smart Guides. Mine's checked, so I'm going to leave that there. All right, now that I have this selection, I've got this kind of little animation happening to display this selection. This visual is referred to as marching ants because you got all these little black dashes moving around your selection. So if you ever hear marching ants, this is what it's referring to. All right, now that I have my selection, how do I fill this with pixels? Well, first let me just pick a nice color, something bright purpley. There we go. This color picker should look very familiar to you. It's just selecting a color and then moving the hue slider. So I'm going to increase the saturation a little, maybe make it more pink. Okay, I like that color. Now that I have my color, I need to come down to my layers palette and make sure that I'm on the layer that I actually want to put these pixels onto. So with that layer selected, I'm going to come up to Edit and then down to Fill. Now this is actually going to give me a lot of options that I don't need to worry about, but the contents should be set to foreground color, which is what I have selected here, and I'll click OK. And there we go, I have a pink square now right in the center of my screen. If I zoom in nice and close, there's my pixel grid. You can see this is made up of tiny little squares, and I'm ready to go. Okay, so I still have my selection active. To get rid of that selection, I need to deselect it. So I need to come up to Select, and then down to deselect. The keyboard shortcut for this is Command D or Control D on a PC. Something you'll be doing all the time, so make sure you memorize that one. Command D to deselect. My selection goes away, and I'm left with just my square. Now I switch to my Move tool by pressing V on the keyboard, and now I have a bounding box showing up around that square, just like any object would inside of Illustrator. If you don't see that bounding box, it's because you don't have Show Transform Controls selected or you're not on the Move tool. So make sure that you have Show Transform Controls checked, and then we'll have that bounding box. Now I can click and drag this, moving it around just like we did in Illustrator. That's great. But now let's say I want to add a circle. I'm going to change my color over here to, how about that blue? That looks pretty good. And then I'm going to hold down on my rectangular marquee tool, and we have another option, elliptical marquee tool. So this is going to make a circle when I click and drag instead of a square. If I hold Shift, it'll be a perfect circle. So I'll make something about this size, let go of my selection, and then fill. Now, instead of going up to edit fill, there actually is a keyboard shortcut for this. It's Option Delete, and that is going to fill with your foreground color. What I mean by foreground color is if we take a look at these two colors here that in Illustrator would be your fill and stroke, are actually foreground and background colors. Now, I can't make one of these active. If I click on it, it just brings up the color picker. Instead, these are basically just like two colors that you can have on hand at any time. So I can swap between them with this arrow right here. I can set them to default of black and white by clicking on this, but just think of them as being able to have a second color on hand at any given point. If I undo by pressing Command Z, and I'm back to just my empty selection, remember Option Delete is filling with the foreground color. I'll undo one more time. Command or Control Delete on a PC will fill with your background color. So those are two keys, Option or Alt and Command or Control plus the Delete key. And by delete, I actually mean the one that would be a backspace when you're typing something out, not the delete key that's next to the Home and End keys. Holding down Option or Command will fill with the foreground or background color. Now, I want this black, so I'm going to undo one more time, Command or Control Z, and then Option Delete. There we go. Now I'm going to deselect by pressing Command D, and my selection is gone. Now let's say that I don't like the position of this circle. Well, if I grab my Move tool, my bounding box is showing up over both of these shapes, and that's interesting. If I try and click and grab this circle, see that both the circle and square are moving together. Now the reason for this is because this is contained onto one layer. Remember, think of your layer kind of like a piece of paper. I put a square at this piece at this point on the piece of paper. I put a circle over here on this point on the piece of paper, and I can't separate those two now. I would have to use scissors or something to cut it out if I want to move them independently of each other. That's exactly how pixels inside of Photoshop work. So if I wanted to be able to move this separately from this, I'm going to need to separate these two objects into their own layers. So let's make another selection. I'm going to grab my rectangular marquee tool and just draw a box around the circle. It doesn't matter how big it is as long as it's containing that entire circle within it. Now I want to move what's in this selection to a new layer. And I could do this by coming up to Edit, Cut, or use the keyboard shortcut of Command X, which is right next to Command C. So Command C is copy, Command V is paste, and Command X is cut. All of three of those keys are right next to each other, and those are definitely keyboard shortcuts that you should learn. All of those commands are right here under the Edit menu. And if you can't remember those keyboard shortcuts, just take a look right over here on the right side. So cut is Command X. Now my selection is gone, and the object within that selection is gone. Now if I want to paste that, I'll just press Command or Control V, and my circle comes back. I have a new layer with the circle on top of it. So now if I switch to my Move tool, I have this object independent of my square. Now, another funny thing about Photoshop is that you might not have auto select on. When I first learned Photoshop, auto select wasn't a thing. So you would literally have to select the layer that you wanted to move, and then you could click anywhere you want in that document, and it's going to move that layer around. But with auto select on, this behaves a lot more like Illustrator, where whatever you click on is what will be selected, and then you can move it around. I much prefer working this way because it just makes selecting and moving objects much more fluid. Now, the stacking order of layers inside of Photoshop is exactly the same as Illustrator. Whatever's on top is going to display on top. So if I want this square to be on top of the circle, I just need to grab that layer, click and drag until I get the little blue highlight right above layer 2, and let go. Now that square is on top of the circle. Now, one really important thing to think about when you're dealing with pixels is, again, that concept of resolution. Because these are all just tiny little squares, they're being calculated by Photoshop in kind of an estimated kind of way. And let me show you what I mean by that. If I make this square really small, I just grab the top right corner, hold down Option and Shift to scale it down proportionally. And then let's say I want to rotate it. I've got my little double arrow rotation arrows. I'll click and drag and then hold Shift to snap it to 45 degrees. Then I'll press this check mark up here to commit that transformation. Now my square is smaller and it's rotated. To be able to see this, I'm just going to click off of it to deselect. So that looks fine. Even if I zoom to 100%, Command 1 or Control 1 on a PC, that looks fine. But if I were then to decide, you know what, I want this square to be big again, I don't like how small that is, I'm going to select it and scale it up, and then press the check mark one more time, suddenly my square looks really blurry. What happened to my perfect square? Well, this goes back to that idea of Photoshop kind of estimating and generating information when you're scaling things and manipulating pixels like this. It's not like vector paths where it's being mathematically calculated, and every time that you scale it up or scale it down, those paths are defining perfect shapes. In the world of pixels, Photoshop can't scale up a raster layer without having to kind of artificially figure out what should be displayed for that missing information. Those pixels are a set defined size, and when you scale something really far down, you're getting rid of a lot of information that was making up the larger version of that same shape. And if you take that smaller version and try and scale it up again, Photoshop doesn't have the memory of what the object looked like before, and it's just trying to generate what it thinks those edge pixels need to look like in order to represent something that's a larger version of that scaled down object. Now, obviously, Photoshop did not do a great job of that, and that's just the way that pixel-based images are going to work. If you remember, that School of Potion logo was extremely tiny. If I scaled it up, it looked really, really blocky, just like this square, and that is exactly why. It is a much more destructive process than working with vectors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad process. It's just something that you have to get used to. You have to understand why these things are happening so that you can deal with them properly. And the reality is, I would never in the real world make flat geometric shapes like this using pixels and selection tools inside of Photoshop. I would use vector tools. Photoshop has vector shape layers, just like in Illustrator, that can scale infinitely. But I'm just using this as an example so you can kind of wrap your head around what pixels are and how they work inside of Photoshop, because it's really important to understand this stuff. I need to undo to get back to where I had the nice looking square. So I'm going to press Command Z once, and I'm going to press it again to go back. Oh, but it didn't go back. Now here is a really kind of frustrating difference between Adobe programs. For whatever reason, Photoshop does not continue to undo every time you press Command Z. Instead, it just steps backwards one edit, and then it steps back forwards. So if you press Command Z or Control Z, it will just continue to go back and forth between what you last did and what you had. In order to get it to step back another step in the history, you need to hold down Command Option Z, and then it will continue to undo. That's Control Alt Z on a PC. That's just one of the differences between Photoshop and pretty much every other Adobe software that you have to just get used to. It's something that you're stuck with, but that does bring up another panel that I want to take a look at that we haven't seen yet, and that's this one right here. It's collapsed right now, so we're not seeing any of it, but if I click on that, it's going to fly out and we'll be able to see it. This is your history palette. If I grab this little bar right here and drag it down, then we can see a list of everything that we've done so far. So if I press Command Z one more time, that's going to go back to exactly where we were. You see the free transform is the command that I had made. That was just transforming a box freely. If I press Command Option Z, it steps back to the previous history state. Command Option Z one more time, it'll go to the move. I can keep doing that and it will step back in time. Now, watch what happens when I press Command Z. You'd think that maybe that would redo one step, but watch what happens. I'm going to press Command Z, and it jumps all the way back down to the most recent history state. So if I press Command Z now, it's going to jump back and forth from where I was and the most recent state. It's just a little bit confusing. It is sometimes frustrating, but the reason why I'm pointing out the history palette is so that you can see all of the edits you made. But not only that, you can click on any one of these and it will jump to that point in the history of your edits. So you can literally think of this like a recorded history or timeline of the edits that you're making inside of Photoshop. So I'm just going to back up to, let's say, right about there, and I'll call it good. Before I go any further, though, I want to point out that you have a limited number of history states. If I scroll up to the top, we can see where I had my original document, and I can see every single step that I've taken so far. But eventually, those earlier states are going to go away. And your default settings of Photoshop might have the undo state set pretty low. I would encourage you to increase those because you might be making lots and lots and lots of changes inside of any given Photoshop document and need to undo very far back in your history. So come up to Photoshop and go down to Preferences and then into Performance. Under this menu, we're going to look for this option right here, History States. Now, the number of history states that you set depends really on your machine's capabilities. The more you set, the more processing and RAM it's going to take from your machine. I have mine set to 100. That's generally enough. By default, I think it's set to 50, and I'd really encourage you to at least jump it up to 100. All right, I'm going to cancel out of that, and we can move on. I want to undo actually a little bit further back. Before I separated these two objects. All right, so here we are. We have our square and our circle on the one layer. Now, I could also move this around within this layer without having to separate it into its own. Because I have this selection made, I have my marching ants there, I can hover over this and we see we've got an arrow that's a hollow white arrow with a selection. Now, if I were to click and drag once, that's just going to reposition my selection. It's not doing anything to the contents of that selection. It's just allowing me to modify this selection. And I can add or subtract from the selection just by holding down Option or Shift. If I held down Option, you see I get this little minus icon on my cursor. If I were to drag a box now and say, take off the top half of this circle, now my selection is that much smaller. But let's say I didn't actually want to do that. Well, I want to add to my selection then. I'll hold Shift, click and drag, and now that selection is expanded to contain the entire circle. That's great, but let's now switch over to our Move tool, and suddenly I have a bounding box around here, and now if I click and drag, see that selection snaps automatically to the actual pixels of what was contained in that selection. Everything outside of that was transparent. There was no information in it. So my selection has now snapped to that object within that selection. And I can click and drag to move it around. So let's say that I want to move it right over here, maybe covering up about half of that square, right about there. I'll call that good. And now I want to deselect to get rid of my selection. So Command D. All right, now that moved the object, that certainly got the job done, but if I click and drag now, these two objects are contained into one layer still, so I can't separate them. And in fact, I can't even make a selection very easily of just the square. If I wanted to try to do that, I would have to come over to my elliptical marquee tool, make a circle selection, hold Shift, and then, very precisely try and place this. Size it exactly to that circle. But the reality is I am never, ever going to be able to make a perfect selection of that circle without grabbing some of these pink pixels. If I zoom in here nice and close, you can see some of these are even halfway between black and that pink color. And if I take a look at the other side, it looks like I didn't even get the entire circle in my selection. So if I were to try and move this now, V on the keyboard to switch to the Move tool, and move it over, that's leaving behind this little bit of the circle, and the pink part of the square is now gone. So this is why I call Photoshop a destructive program, because when you're putting objects on top of each other, when they're on the same layer, you're losing all of that information that was there. Everything behind what's on top is gone. So that's why it's very important to really think about how you're structuring your layers, whether or not objects should be on one layer or multiple layers, and just understanding how pixels are interacting with each other. They're not going to be able to be separated once they're merged together, at least not very easily. Now I'm going to undo to go back to where my circle was on top of my square, Command D to deselect, and I want to take a look at another tool. You saw that it was not very easy to make a selection of that circle using the elliptical marquee tool. Well, down here we have the magic wand tool. If I click on that, the icon is exactly the same as what we had in Illustrator, and the basic functionality is very similar to what we had in Illustrator. Remember, you could click on any object and customize what other objects it would select based on what you click on. In Photoshop, it's kind of simpler. It's going to select pixels that are similar to what you're clicking on. And we have options up here. The tolerance is set to 32, so it's going to give a range of values similar to what you're clicking on, not just the one color. If I change this down to 0 and clicked on the pink, it's only going to select colors that are exactly that pink color. So zooming in here, it would not select any of these in-between colors between the black and the pink. All right, so now that we've kind of defined what that tool does, I'm going to select it and then click on this circle. And there we go, we've made a selection of our circle. It's actually pretty perfect. If I zoom in here, it looks like it's contained all of the pixels on the outside. On the inside is where we might have a little bit of trouble because it's not going to select everything out of the pink, and it's bringing some of that pink into the black. But that is just the nature of combining pixels like that inside of Photoshop. But because I have my nice circular selection here, I'm going to press Command X and then Command Shift V to paste in place. Command V, just like in Illustrator, pastes in the center of whatever your view is. So if I was over here and I press Command V, it's in the center. But if I press Command Shift V, it pastes it right in place, but on a new layer. So I can grab my Move tool, move that circle around. But looking very close, you see some of that pink has shown up again. Now, I would never be working like this, but I'm just using it as an example to show you how the Magic Wand tool can work and why this is not a good idea. Why you would never want to put two objects that you might need to move around independently on the same layer on top of each other. All right, now that we kind of have a basic understanding of what's happening with pixels inside of Photoshop, let's actually start working on this style frame. So I'm going to get rid of both of these layers by selecting them both, clicking on the first one, shift clicking on the second one, and then clicking on the delete trash can. I'll click yes to delete the selected layers. Now I have an empty artboard. On my desktop, I have this sheet from my creative director. This is a hand-sketched kind of a layout preview of what he thinks would be a good layout for this style frame that I'll be working on. So right here we've got a box representing the frame. So this is the actual canvas that I'm going to be working on. And then we have a couple of elements in here. So over here we have a box with an X through it and this text that says well-groomed man. Now my creative director is not telling me he wants to see a box with an X through it and some text that says well-groomed man. This is kind of like a placeholder. This box is like a wireframe. The X just means that this is a placeholder box. This is about where he wants to see a picture of a well-groomed man, and he wants to take up about that much of the frame. This is very rough, very loose. This is not at all something that I'm going to take into Photoshop and line up perfectly. I'm just using it as a guide. Over here we've got another box with an X through it, so that's telling me it's going to be another image asset. That's going to be the product. And then we have two lines of text here, stacked text for the tagline. So right here, he just wrote out two kind of little scribbles inside of boxes. That'll be where the text goes. And then down at the bottom, he says, add some grungy texture to the background. So that'll be something we'll have to play around with. But that's kind of my roadmap, my guide for what this style frame should look like. And then I have the actual product. This is a 3D render of the product. So there we go, Bartleman's Choice Pomade. That's a nice little product shot. And then I have a picture of a well-groomed man. So there we go. Those are the assets that I have to work with. And based on this hand-sketched layout from my creative director, I'm going to now build out a style frame that I think would work well for an ad for this piece. All right, so let's first get some of our assets into this document. Now, Photoshop can just open up an image as its own document. So if I were to grab this image right here and drag it down to my Photoshop icon, then it's just going to open it up as an image. And from here, I could work on it just like any other document, but that's not going to do what I need it to. I need this image inside of my other document. So I'm going to close that out and come up to File and then down to Place Embedded. Now there are two different options, Place Embedded and Place Linked. I want Place Embedded, so it's actually going to bring that image into my document, and whatever I do that image in my document will not affect the source file. So Place Embedded, and then I need to find that image right here and then place it. Now Photoshop is going to automatically size it to whatever is smaller, the width or the height of my document. And I think that's fine just the way it is, so I'll click on the check mark, and now that is showing up as a layer within my document. But there is a difference between this layer and the other layers that we were already working with. If we take a look at the thumbnail right here and I highlight over this icon, it tells me that this is a smart object. Now, smart objects are a very powerful feature in Photoshop that allow you to work much less destructively inside of a pretty destructive environment. You can think of a pixel-based smart object kind of like an external document that's containing the full resolution image. So if I double-click on that smart object icon, it's going to open up a second document in Photoshop. You see that I have two open now. And the second one is the full resolution photograph of this man. If I zoom to 100% by pressing Command 1, you can see this is incredibly detailed. It's a very, very high resolution image. If we take a look at our properties panel, it's 7,300 pixels wide by 4,900 pixels tall. Way, way bigger than our actual 1920 by 1080 document. That's really great for us though, because if I close out of this and I say scale this image way down, just like we did with that pink square, that's super tiny. And if I zoom in nice and close, it looks really, really pixelated at this zoom level, but at 100%, you can kind of still make out the details. That's a man combing his hair. But if I zoom out, select my layer, and then scale this up again, you can see that all of those details are still there. I'll just set it to right about there, click the check mark, and zoom to 100%, and there we go. All of those details are preserved. And that is exactly why we're going to be using smart objects all the time, because it makes things so much less destructive inside of Photoshop. By default, when you bring in a photo like this, it's going to automatically create a smart object out of it, so you don't even really have to think about it. But just be aware, this icon means smart object. If it's not there, it's not a smart object, and any changes you make to that layer will be destructive. Okay, let's take a look at our style frame guide one more time. And actually, I'm just going to open this up in Photoshop. So the photograph should be on the right side about this spot on the artboard, so I'm going to move that around, and then probably scale it down just a little bit. Something like that. Because I have my smart guides on, it's going to snap to the bottom of my document. That looks good, and I can press the check mark to commit those changes. All right, now obviously my document is empty over here. If I turn on my transparency, we've got the background of the photo, but that's not extending to the background of the entire document. So I'm definitely going to have to do some work here, probably cutting him out from the background and just eliminating his background altogether and putting it on one that I make. But we'll worry about that in just a little bit. Next up is the product. So let's bring that in. I'm going to go again to File, Place Embedded. Then on my desktop, I have my Bartleman's Choice Pomade jar. Place that. And there's something interesting about this that you should notice. If I scale it down, there is no background. There are actually pixels here that are transparent. The jar itself has no background to it. And that is going to be really beneficial because I don't have to cut it out from the background and I can just place it wherever I want to. Now I'm going to click on the check mark, and that's going to make it a smart object. So I can move this around, resize it if I need to. But I want to point something out about these two different files. This one right here was a JPEG.jpg. If we look, the end of the file name is JPEG. So that's kind of interchangeable between JPEG and JPG. Those are JPEG images, and that file format does not support transparency. So I could never have transparency saved within this file. But this image right here, the extension is PNG. This file format does support transparency, so that's why you can see through to the background around these edges. If we go right here, you can kind of see the School of Motion logo blurred out behind there. And that's something you really need to be aware of, because if you ever need to export a graphic out of Illustrator, say, that needs transparency, if you do it as a PNG, you can preserve that transparency. A JPEG isn't going to do that. All right, so I've got my two different types of files here, and it looks like the product needs to be pretty small around this spot on the frame. So I'm going to scale that down and roughly place it where I think it should go. This is snapping to my left edge of my other photo. I kind of want it right about here, and that's making it difficult. So I'm just going to hold down Control on the keyboard, and that is going to temporarily disable any snapping, and that's kind of universal with all of Photoshop. Holding down Control during any time that something is snapping and you don't want it will disable it temporarily. I'm going to place it right about there and then press the check mark. And then next up we have the tagline, stack text for the tagline on 2 lines. And the tagline is Pamper Your Pompadour. So I need to get some text in here, just like I would in Illustrator. The type tool is right here, so I'm going to click on it. Same type of icon. And then I need to type out my text. So I'm going to just click once, and I get this blinking cursor, and type out pamper your, and then I'm guessing the next line is going to be pompadour, which I believe is pompadour, like that, and then a period. To commit this, I'm going to click on the check mark, and that's much bigger than it needs to be, and that's not the right font, so I'm going to scale it down. And something I want to point out is that because this is a text layer, and we look over here, it doesn't have the same kind of icon for the thumbnail. Instead, it has a T telling me this is a text layer. And the name of that layer is automatically whatever is contained within the text you typed out. But because this is a text layer, it actually isn't pixel-based. It's vector-based. Fonts are vector-based graphics. So I could scale this back up. Let me undo that. Scale this back up to whatever I want and press the check mark, and it's going to re-rasterize that text and be nice, crisp, and clean. So very similar to how a smart object works. So I'm going to scale that back down and put it about where I want it. And then I need to change the font. Now the font that they want me to use is called Clarendon Text Pro and the bold version. So that's this one right here. I'll click on it and then scale that down so it's about that size right above the jar. I think that's how the style frame was laid out. Yes, okay, so those are my three main elements: the photo, the jar of pomade, the actual product, and these 2 lines of text. So I have the basic structure of my style frame here, but it clearly isn't a good representation of what the final is going to be. I have this background in the photograph that I have to deal with. The colors aren't the same. I have to actually make a background, which the style frame layout guide from my creative director said have some texture in the background, so I'm going to have to come up with that. But let's start by getting this man separated from the background. Now you might have already guessed that there are lots of different ways to do just about anything inside of Photoshop, and extracting somebody from the background of a photo is no exception. There are lots of different ways to do it, and knowing which one to use really depends on what your subject matter is, and just having the experience of using the different methods and techniques to know which one's going to work best for your particular photo. So let's just step through a couple of the different options that we have right now. Now, I can't actually manipulate any of the pixels of this image because it is a smart object, but just temporarily, I'm going to rasterize this image. If you remember what rasterizing is it's going to convert what you're seeing into pixels that are destructive, and I will no longer be able to scale this image up without losing quality. So I'm going to right-click on the layer and come up to Rasterize Layer. That will get rid of my icon. I only have the pixels that I'm seeing now, and I cannot scale them up anymore. But now I can start, say, taking out the background. So I'm going to switch down to this tool right here. This is my eraser tool. And as you can see in that little preview window, it literally is going to start erasing pixels just like you would, erase a pencil sketch on paper. So my brush is pretty big up here. It's 76 pixels wide, and you can see the circle, the diameter of that eraser as I hover over the image. So if I were to just come over here and start clicking and dragging, I could start erasing the background. And, I could do a pretty rough job to get a big chunks of this image out of the way, but uh-oh, I just erased part of him. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about that except undo. So I'll back up. I lost a lot of my progress, so I'm going to have to undo some more, or erase some more, and it's just not at all something that works very intuitively. As I get closer to his arm here, it's not easy to do this with a mouse, and inevitably I'm going to erase something that I didn't want to, or I have to zoom in nice and close and be really, really careful, and there I'm taking out part of his arm. It's just not at all something that I would recommend doing. So let me undo back to where, before I rasterize the layer actually, and we're going to keep this non-destructive smart object and instead use a technique called masking. Masking is a way to show or hide parts of a layer a lot less destructively. To add a mask to this layer, I need to come down to this button right here at the bottom of my layers palette, which is Add Layer Mask. This adds a new thumbnail on that layer, and it is representing the layer mask. It's just a pure white box right now, and the way that a mask works, a pixel layer-based mask works, is by using grayscale values. So white pixels, which in this case it is 100% white, represent 100% opacity. And black pixels represent 0% opacity. So if I hold down Option and click on that mask, I just have this white filled rectangle. That is, all the mask contains is 100% white pixels, so all of my image is visible. But just like I had the eraser tool to erase pixels, we have a tool right here called the brush tool, which allows you to paint pixels on. So if I were to select that brush tool, then I'll make sure that my foreground color is black, and I can start painting on my image just by clicking and dragging. And as I do that, you see that it's removing pixels. Now, this is a very, very soft brush. Another term for this is feathered. If we take a look at this icon right here, and I click on it, you can see that the hardness is set to 0. So that's going to give me a preview right here of what that brushstroke looks like. It's very soft. But the next one down here is hard round. I could have just moved this slider around, but hard round is the next option. Now when I do this, you see that I have a very clean, crisp edge. And I can again do this same process of trying to fit it to his arm, and I accidentally cut off some of his elbow here. Well, let's take a look at our layer mask again. You can see that it's not pure white anymore. If I hold down Option or Alt and click on that, you can see that I was painting black on top of that white, and anything that is black, if I turn that off, is transparent. This is the basics of how a layer mask works. So I can continue to paint this in black and then just swap my fill and stroke by clicking on this arrow or by pressing the X key on the keyboard. And I could paint some of that arm back in. Let me zoom in nice and close so I can see, and maybe even make my brush smaller. I could do that by coming up to my brush and turning down the size. Or there's a keyboard shortcut, the left and right bracket keys on the keyboard will incrementally scale that up or down. So I can paint some of his elbow back in like this, switch my foreground and background by pressing X, and then paint that out a little bit more precisely. Now this is one way to be able to mask an image out, but as you can see, it's very time consuming and it's definitely easy to make mistakes. So you might be doing a lot of corrections painting pixels back in this way. I don't want to mask him out this way because of how long that would take. So I'm going to actually just right click on that layer and say delete layer mask. And instead, I want to mask this out using a vector mask. So just like inside of Illustrator, using vector paths to make objects and shapes, we can use vector paths inside of Photoshop as a mask. So I'm going to switch to my pen tool, which is right here. And this should be very familiar to you. It behaves almost identically to what it does inside of Illustrator. I just want to make sure that under my controls that I'm going to be drawing a path and not a shape. I don't want this to be a shape layer like in Illustrator where it has fills and strokes. I just want it to be an empty path. Then I need to just start tracing this image. So let me zoom in here nice and close and just start at the bottom. So P on the keyboard is the pen tool. I'll click once to add a point and then come up to this point where it meets the elbow. Click and drag a little bit, and then hold Option or Alt to break the relationship between those handles and continue my mask. This is the exact same process as recreating that logo inside of Illustrator. I'm just following the contour of the photograph instead of an actual 2D vector graphic. Now, in the case of photographs, there are obviously way more details, so you can see that I'm adding a lot more points here. I'm just doing my best to fit the path to the actual photograph. So I'm just going to continue this along his arm. There's going to be portions of photographs where details are much more smooth, like this arm, where you'll need a lot less points. But I'm just going to continue this process around the entire photograph. And I would approach this in a very similar way as we did with tracing a logo, and that is using as few points as possible. But don't worry if you do have to add a lot more points than you think you are necessary. Like around these knuckles, I'm definitely going to want to fit the contour of this so I'm not cutting off any of his hand. And I'll zoom in nice and close. Switch to my selection tool here. A on the keyboard, just like in Illustrator. I want to select my direct selection tool. So I click and hold down on that, go to that direct selection tool, so I can select just this point and reposition it and manipulate these handles. So there we go. Now that fits much better. I'll click on this point, press P on the keyboard, and continue drawing. But like I said, you're going to be using probably a lot more points than you were inside of Illustrator when you're tracing something like this. But the keyboard shortcuts are exactly the same. The way that you're interacting with the pen tool, spacebar while you're clicking and dragging to move points around, and then holding Option while you're on the pen tool to switch to the Convert Anchor Point tool to manipulate those handles. Now we're getting to a point where it's a little bit difficult to see the edges of the hair, and some of the details in his hair are very, very fine. You know, you can see all these little strands of hair. Now, there are tools inside of Photoshop that allow us to make selections and mask that kind of thing out very precisely. But in this case, for this example, I'm just going to use the pen tool to kind of just roughly get the shape of the hair contained within a path. So I'm just going to do my best to follow the contour of the hair without getting caught up too much in the little details. It looks like right about there is where it comes back down around the comb. And then all these little tiny strands of hair, I'm not going to worry about. I'm just going to kind of smooth this out, follow the edge of this head, come down to his ear, and then we're back to something that's a little bit more solid. This, part of his ear isn't going to have all these tiny little details like his hair does. And the great thing about these vector paths are that they are 100% vector. They're non-destructive. You can make adjustments to them infinitely. And if you accidentally cut something out or leave something in that shouldn't be, you can make that adjustment after the fact very easily. All right, coming around his shoulder here, almost around the entire thing. There are some details, little wrinkles in his shirt here on the back that I'm going to want to preserve. For the most part, though, this is a very smooth shape coming around the backside of his shirt. All right, now I'm off the bottom of the image. I just need to close my path. So I'm going to click on the original point, and there we go. I have a closed path. Now that this path exists, I can add it as a mask to my layer. So I'm going to select that layer and click on the mask button once, and that adds a layer mask, which isn't what I want. But if I click it one more time, there we go. Now I have a vector mask. Everything outside of that path has now disappeared, and I can actually delete that vector or that raster mask, the layer mask. So I'll right click on it, say delete layer mask, and I'm left with just my vector path mask. We can see that shape showing up in that thumbnail. But obviously I still have this gap right in here that I need to cut out, and this one right in here. I can do all of this on this single mask path. So if I zoom in nice and close, I can start drawing another path in here. So I'm going to press P on the keyboard and start my path and just continue to trace the inside of this photo to get rid of the background from between his arms here. Now there are a lot of little details in here with all the teeth of the comb, but that is something I do want to preserve. So this is just a case where it's going to take me some time, but I'm going to want to make a very careful path around every single one of these teeth inside the comb, making sure not to cut out his thumb there in the background right there. And that's just the reality of making masks sometimes. This is going to be a little bit of a labor-intense process, but that is what it will take to make very nice selections. And I am more than likely going to want to go in here and clean this up a little bit more. Sometimes this pixel grid can actually be really difficult and interfering with what you're trying to see. So I'm going to come up to View, Show, and turn off my pixel grid for now. So I can see the teeth from the comb very nice and clearly. And that way I can make a better selection with my mask. All right, I think that was the last tooth that I have to actually cut out. Some of this is kind of guessing where these edges need to be. But like I said, because they are vector paths, I'm always going to be able to edit these after the fact if something looks a little bit off. All right, so I've got my path for that hole, but it isn't actually cutting a hole out. And that's because I have to tell Photoshop I want this path to subtract from the image and not add to it. If I switch to my direct selection tool or just my path selection tool, then up here I have this little icon. This kind of looks similar to the Pathfinder tools inside of Illustrator, but by default it's saying that it wants to combine the shapes using these paths. With that path selected, I want to change it from combine to subtract. When I do that, then it's going to punch a hole in that path. I can deselect, and there we go. We've got a nice selection punching a hole out of that part of the background. Now I need to do the exact same thing right here, and maybe right here as well, and I can move on. So let's switch back to the pen tool, start with this arm. Another reason why you can add a lot of points in something like this is because you're not trying to make a super clean 2D vector graphic. We're just using vector paths to make a selection of something that isn't vector or 2D at all. It is a three-dimensional photograph. This is an organic being. It's not something that we want to look super clean, cartoony at all. So even though we're using vector paths, we're using them in a way to make selections that are non-destructive, not in a way to make super clean, very flat-looking artwork. All right, it looks like I just need to move this point a little bit, right about there, and then switch that to subtract as well. So I will switch to my path selection tool, A on the keyboard, which, by the way, any one of these tools, if they have multiple, tools underneath them, if you hold down on any one of them, like the rectangular marquee tool and elliptical marquee tool, both have the keyboard shortcut of M. And the selection tool, path selection and direct selection tool both have an A on them. If I press A once, it goes to that tool. If I press M once, it goes to that tool. But how do you get to the other one? Well, just hold down Shift and then the keyboard shortcut. So Shift A will switch between selection and direct selection. All right, with that path selected, I'm going to switch that from combine to subtract, and something didn't work. Okay, I see what happened. So what happened here is that I didn't actually have my path selected, the mask path selected, which we can see right here. There's the paths. When I drew that next path, I must have deselected the layer, or at least the path itself, and then started drawing. And when you do that, it generates a completely new path that's unrelated to what you were working on. Now, how do I get that selection back? It's not showing up anywhere. Fortunately, we have a paths palette. If I were to start drawing a new path, then I would have lost it completely. But if I click on this work path, that is the working path that I was working on at the time. So I'll select that again, go back to my layers, and I will copy that, Command-C or Control-C, select my layer mask, and then paste, Command-V, or Control V on a PC. There we go. Now that's showing up. It's set to subtract, so we're seeing it right where it needs to be. It looks like part of the background is showing up there on his hand, so I'm going to just move this around a little bit and try and get it to fit more nicely. Looks like right about there is going to work. All right, and then finally, it looks like I need to do a little bit right here. So I'm going to select my mask path, press P on the keyboard, and then start drawing. And that should draw the path directly on this layer. There we go. I'll just switch that to subtract. And sure enough, it worked. It removed that part of the image, and I now have my subject removed from the background of that photograph. And if I disable this layer mask by right-clicking and saying disable vector mask, you can see that that information of that photograph is still there. And I can continue to set up my design. Now, because these are vector paths and it is a smart object, I can still scale this up or down and not lose any quality, because the vector masks are vector. They're going to be able to scale infinitely, and the smart object is going to allow me to scale that up to 100% of the source resolution. So I'm going to undo that just so it goes back to where it was, and maybe I'll scale him up just a little bit to fit that space a little bit more. But there we go. I've successfully cut out my subject from the background of that photograph, and I now have kind of a clean background to work with, making my own design. But before I do anything else, I need to save my document. So Command or Control S, I'm just going to put it on the desktop, and I'll call this Bartleman's Style Frame 01 and click Save. Now that is going to save it as a PSD, .psd for Photoshop document. Just like Illustrator has .ai, PSD is Photoshop's native file format that preserves all of these layers and all of these settings so that you can open it up and edit it further. All right, now I think the next logical step for this particular style frame would be to add in a background. Now I want this to be kind of a warm background. The jar is basically what I'm going to be basing my colors off of. So this nice bright yellow color is pretty cool. So I'm thinking maybe a yellow, maybe potentially a little bit of orange for that background. And if you remember, the style frame guide from my creative director said to add some grungy texture to the background. So we're going to have to add some kind of a texture to that as well. Now, to make a solid color in the background, I'm going to use another type of layer that we haven't touched yet. So if we come down to the Layers palette, right here, this button right here is going to create a new fill or adjustment layer. We're going to get to adjustment layers in the next lesson. For right now, I'm going to focus on solid color right up here at the top. If I click on that, it's going to make a new layer, and it's going to ask me what color do I want it to be. I'm just going to try and make a best guess as to something that's going to fit with that, that logo, that jar of the pomade. Click OK, and that put the layer right at the top of my layer stack so I can't see anything underneath it. So I'm going to click and drag that all the way down to the bottom. All right, now let's take a look at the actual layer itself. It's behind everything else. We've got a color square right here. That's telling me that this is a solid layer. Then we have a layer mask. It's automatically given me a layer mask on this layer. And then it's given me the name of Color Fill 1, which this is a good time to actually start organizing my layers a little bit. I'm going to rename my layers just like we rename the objects in Illustrator. So I'm going to call this BG Color for background color. This is my photograph, so I'm going to rename it Man. And then I've got the Bartleman's jar. That was the name of the file. So that actually is fine. And then Pamper Your Pompadour, that's the text layer. Okay, so everything's nice and organized. But this layer mask is there by default because it's allowing you to be able to mask off different parts of that solid layer. So far, all I've been doing with this masking is pure black or pure white. So it's 100% transparent or 100% visible. But you can use any shade of gray in between there to get semi-transparent pixels. So if I were to change my black to, halfway around 50% brightness, then I'm only going to be painting out partial transparency on that layer. If I go over to my layer mask and hold Option to make that mask visible, you can see that's gray. So those pixels are not 100% transparent. Because of this, you can do some really creative things with things like gradients. Now, I don't want to get too far in depth in this yet because I'm not really going to be needing it for this particular style frame, but if I come over to my gradient tool right here, and I set my colors back to black and white, I'm going to get a preview of this tool up here, what colors I'm going to be using when I use my gradient tool. So this is saying that my gradient is going to go from white to black. And if I click and drag anywhere on this layer mask, it's going to apply that gradient to the mask. So if we look at the mask one more time, we've got a gradient going from pure white to pure black, and everything there in between is semi-transparent. So my solid fill color is going from this pure yellow color to nothing. There's nothing in the background. If I were to turn on my artboard color, that would look a little bit different. We said white, then the color actually disappeared. Now this is something interesting. Inside of your artboards, you have to make sure that you contain all of your layers in them if you want them visible. I accidentally dragged this layer all the way out of my artboard. So if I collapse it, you can see that layer exists pretty much in this void of nothing. So I need to drag that back into the artboard and drag it to the bottom of the artboard. Not all the way down here outside the artboard, but right there. And there we go. Now that yellow is going to fade from the pure yellow into the white transparency. All right, now obviously, again, I did not want that. In fact, I don't even need a mask on this solid fill, so I'm just gonna right click on it and say delete layer mask. Then I'm gonna go to my artboard properties one more time, click on the artboard and change that back to transparent. Okay, so I've got my solid yellow color and it's close to that label, but I don't think it's quite right. It's a little bit too orange, I think. So I'm going to double click on that color and that brings up the color picker again. Now I could, shift this around a little bit, get it to be a little bit more close to that label, or if I move my mouse over here, you see that I have an eyedropper tool icon, and this allows me to click on any color in my image. If I clicked on his shirt, it's going to go to that gray color or his skin color, the brown color here. Whatever I do, if I click and drag, I can kind of interactively update that background color. I want to do something similar to that jar, but then make it maybe slightly less saturated, a little bit darker. Actually, no, that's not looking too good. Maybe I just want to make it slightly more orange, right about there. And we'll start with that. I'll click on OK. And next, I want to match my text color to this label color. The actual logo you see is more of a brown color, and I just made this text black. So I'm going to select that text layer, and I could come to my properties panel and click on the color right here. And again, that eyedropper comes up as I move it into my document. I'll click on that part. There it updates to the brown. I'll click OK. And now I think I want to resize these two assets a little bit. I think they're a little bit bigger than they need to be. So I'm going to select both of them by clicking on this one and then shift clicking on the other layer and scale them both down. So maybe something more like that. I'll move it up a little bit. And then I want to make sure that they're aligned to each other nice and centered on that horizontal axis. So I'm going to select the text layer and move this around until I get that guideline right there saying that's the center of the jar. So now I know those two are nice and centered up. And with this text selected, I'm just going to take a look at the properties panel and see that I'm almost at a whole 52 points on that text. I just like to work with round numbers, so I'm going to drop that down to 52. And then this next line down here is the leading. This is the distance between lines. That's what leading is referring to. So I'm going to set that to be an equal 52 as well. So 52 points for the height of the characters and then 52 points between lines. You saw that I can just click and drag that to adjust it, or you could choose one of the presets or even just type in a number like I did. All right, now that text is center justified. If yours isn't and you want to center justify it, that's what these controls are for. Left justification, right justification, and that just means the edge that it's aligning the lines to. So left justification puts the lines aligned to the left, center justification will keep them nice and centered. I think that looks pretty good. And I think the jar, I could just scale up just a tiny bit more, something around 280 pixels. That looks pretty good. And now I'm just looking for a good balance of these three elements on the frame. Again, this is a visual almost feeling that I have. I'm just trying to see how these three assets are working together on the frame. I think that the guy could move a little bit over to the right, And this text might be just a little too big. Maybe I'll turn the point size down to 50. Just that little difference makes it feel a little less big and bold on the frame. I don't want it to be too heavy there, but I think the relationship between that and the jar are working fairly well. And then this half of the frame, even a little bit more than that half of the frame, is being taken up by the subject of the photo, which really is the star of this shot. Obviously, the product is important, but we're kind of showing off, you can look like this guy if you use this pomade. Now I want to zoom in here nice and close on the teeth of this comb one more time, because it looks to me like I might have missed one of the teeth. If I go to that mask and hold down Shift and click on that mask, it's going to disable it temporarily. And it looks to me like this path right here for this tooth is a little bit off. So I'm going to grab that point and move it out a little bit, right about there instead. And I think that gap is now a little bit more consistent with the rest of the teeth. Now, zooming in here nice and close, you can start to see a lot of little problems. But I think that for the most part, this is a pretty good selection. So I'm just quickly scanning around this image to see if any parts of the background are showing up where they shouldn't. It's going to be a lot less noticeable on his clothes since his shirt is actually pretty dark. But like right there, that's a little bit of the background showing through. So I could make that path just a little bit more close to the actual photograph. And then around his ear, there's some dark pixels here. I can move that in. But another thing that can help with this, because this is such a clean, crisp edge right now, is softening the edge. And this is a really, really great feature of masks in Photoshop. So if I were to click on that mask and look at the properties panel, I have some options here. I'm going to expand this out a little bit. But we have density and feather. Feather is the one that I'm concerned with. What this is going to let us do is soften the edge. Now, I don't want to do it very much because obviously I don't want it to look all, clouded out and glowy almost. But if I just turn this up, maybe even just a half a pixel, 0.4, 0.5, that is going to just give a little bit of softness to the entire edge of the image and kind of make it flow into the rest of the design just a little bit. Now that might even be too much because you can see the teeth of the comb are almost looking a little bit blurry there. So I'm going to turn that down to say 0.3, and I think that's better. That's still giving just a little soft edge to the overall image. This is before, and then this is after. So there you go. Just a little bit of softness, and that can really help with your masking. That applies to not just vector paths, but also raster layer masks. You can feather out a pixel-based mask in the same way. I think the only other thing that's really bothering me about this mask is this one particular tooth in the comb just looks a little bit fatter than the others. So I'm going to redo that a little bit, just reposition the points to get that one looking more consistent with the rest of them. There we go. I think that's better. All right, now that that mask is all set up, my assets are placed, I need to come up with some kind of a texture for the background. And this is one of the instances where Photoshop really shines. It's great for being able to make very organic looking textures that you just couldn't do with vector paths. And I'm going to be using the brush tool to do this. We've already touched on the brush tool a little bit, but now we can dive a little bit deeper into it. So first of all, I'm going to make a new layer. And just to make this a little bit simpler to see what's going on, I'm going to turn off all the other assets and just leave the background. Now, with the brush tool selected, we've already seen that I can just draw around, kind of randomly. Obviously, that doesn't look all that great. You can control the brush shape. You can, control how big it is and how hard it is to make different types of brush strokes. But Photoshop brushes can be much more complex than this. If you take a look, there are these groups of folders here inside of my brushes drop-down menu. Right now, general brushes just give us some different standard-looking brushes. But if we go into, say, dry media brushes, then we have this selection of things that are a lot more textured. And these are all just preview images of what these brushes will do. So if I click on this one and bring my mouse out here, you see that the icon for my brush has updated. And if I click and drag, now I have a textured edge, and that is clearly much different than what I had before. Now, drawing like this still doesn't look all that great because I'm just clicking and dragging my mouse around. Whoops, here we go. I'm gonna clear this layer out by selecting everything, Command A or Control A to make a selection of the entire document, and then pressing Delete to clear it all out. Deselect with Command or Control D, and I'm back to my empty layer. Now I own a Wacom graphics tablet. This is an Intuos Pro graphics tablet, and it comes with a stylus that's like a pen, and it allows me to draw inside of Photoshop and any program on my computer a lot like you would on a piece of paper with a real pencil. Now, what's so great about these graphics tablets is that it's able to record the pressure sensitivity, how hard you're pressing down on the tablet, and not only that, this Intuos Pro can also control the tilt. It can tell how you're tilting your pencil as you're drawing. And Photoshop brushes are very advanced systems. You're able to translate that pressure sensitivity and tilt to different parameters of your brush tool. So watch what happens when I use my graphics tablet instead of the mouse to draw. I can start out really light and have this light texture, and if I press harder, it gets darker and darker and wider. So these brush strokes will look much more natural than if I was just using my mouse. So this is, again, my pen tool, the actual stylus pen on my graphics tablet, and this is my mouse, clicking and dragging. There is no pressure sensitivity because my mouse can't record that information. So having a graphics tablet is a huge advantage for when you're drawing inside of a program like Photoshop. And there are lots of options out there with lots of different price ranges, and we'll put together a guide for you if you're interested in getting into something like this to be able to draw things digitally. But even without a graphics tablet, you can still do some pretty cool stuff with these brushes inside of Photoshop. So if I change my brushes again, close this one up, I'm going to come down to this folder right here, which is called Megapack. There's a guy called Kyle T. Webster. He is an amazing artist on his own, but he's also just put a whole ton of effort into creating really, really natural looking brushes that are all digital in Photoshop, and they're actually available for free through your Adobe Creative Cloud library. These folders up here are standard with Photoshop, and they kind of give you a sense of what you can do with them. So these, anywhere you see the Kyle or Kyle's, that's Kyle T. Webster, you can know that those are really, really natural looking advanced brushes. But there's a lot more than just the ones that are shipped with Photoshop. So if you come up to this little settings icon right here and click on Get More Brushes, that's going to open up a browser window that's going to give you access to all of Kyle's brush packs. Now, you can definitely look through all of these if you're interested. I downloaded the Mega Pack because it's very, very extensive. There are lots of options in there that cover a whole lot of different range of brush types. But as you can see, there are watercolor packs, dry media packs, runny inkers, all of these really, really natural looking brushes that are really, really awesome, and they're all included with the Creative Cloud subscription. If you've downloaded one of the brush packs, the way to install it is to come to this little gear icon right here and then say Import Brushes. Then you just got to navigate to the file that you downloaded, and Photoshop will automatically bring them all in just like this. So I already have my Mega Pack selected. I'm going to open that up, and you'll see that there are lots of categories, and inside each one of these is a whole lot of brushes. So it's going to take some time just exploring all of the brushes that you have access to see what they can do. But they are categorized and organized in a very logical way. So if you're looking for something that looks like a pen, he has an entire tech pen folder. Or if you want something that's just your standard drawing tools, there are a lot of options for standard pencils or charcoals or even markers, things like that, crayons, that are really great for giving textured brush strokes. But there's one in particular in here that I want to try and find. It's called New Pastel, right here. Kyle's Drawing Box, New Pastel. I'm going to click on that so it's active, and you see that I've got kind of a square icon over here. If I close this up and click and drag, it's again just going to be kind of a dark, thick line with some textured edge. So I'll undo that, but then I want to take a look at these options up here, particularly this option, Flow. This is going to control basically how much texture is being applied as you're dragging your mouse around. So right now by default it's set to 70, and that's what this looks like. But if I turn this down to say 26, then it's going to look like this. More texture is showing through. If I turn this way down to say 2%, then I'm going to get a very light texture. So even with my mouse, I'm able to produce some original looking textures, and I can overlap them, click and click and click to get something unique. All right, so now that we have that flow turned down, I'm going to clear this layer out one more time, again, selecting all, Command or Control A, and then pressing Delete. Then I'll deselect, Command or Control D, and I'm back to my empty layer. Now that I have this texture working the way that I want to make it really, really big. So again, you can change your brush size by coming up to the brush menu and turning the size up. Or if you want to see that size change as you're adjusting, just use the keyboard shortcut of the right bracket to increase the size. All right, now this is super, super big and chunky, and what I want to do is just kind of scribble over the entire canvas. And you'll see this slows down my machine. And that's because this is kind of a complex process of using a high resolution texture to generate this brush stroke, but you saw that kind of go over the same pattern that I move my mouse. It just takes a little bit of processing time, but eventually here I am with my texture, and it looks pretty grungy. But obviously this is black, and that's not what I want. So how do I get this to be just like a darker version of my background color? Well, there are lots of different ways to do this, just like most things in Photoshop. But what I'm going to do is just duplicate my background color. And to do that, I'm just going to click and drag it to the new layer icon. Now I have two different BG colors, so I'm going to rename this BG color darker. Next, I want to make this a darker color, so I'm going to double click on it and then just bring it down a little bit, maybe increase the saturation and then shift the hue just a little bit. So now it is a darker version of that yellow color. I'll click OK, and then I want to add a mask to this layer. So I'm going to click on the vector or the layer mask once. That will add a layer mask that's 100% white, so we see the entire layer still. But what I want to do is use this brush texture that I just made as the layer mask for that layer. To do that, all I have to do is select all, Command A, and then copy, Command C. I'll hide that layer, deselect, Command D, and then press Option or Alt and click on that layer mask so that I'm now editing that mask and paste that texture inside of it. Now you see this has a ton of crazy marching ants on it because the original layer where I had brushed that texture on had a lot of transparency to it, and it was a very complex pixel-based texture. But don't let that scare you. All I have to do is deselect, Command D, and now that texture is my layer mask. If I press Option and click on that layer mask again, it's very faint, but there is texture on that background. If I make that color just a little bit darker, it's going to be much more apparent what's going on here. So there we go. Now you can see that texture being used as a mask on top of this darker color. If I turn that on and off, you can see what that looks like. If I turn the background color off, you can see just how much of that layer was transparent. So even just with my mouse, I was able to use the brush tool and some of these really great textured brushes to make a very unique looking grungy texture on my background. Now that that's there, I'm going to turn my other layers back on, and I can go ahead and delete this original texture layer at the top. So I'll just select that, click delete, and then say yes. And there we go. Now I have a grungy texture background. Now I did that entire process in a little bit of a roundabout way where I brushed the texture on its own layer and then I copied and pasted it into a layer mask, but you can actually draw with these brush tools directly into a layer mask. So I want to add a little bit of texture to this text so it matches the background a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that brushing into a layer mask directly right now. I'm going to select that layer and add a layer mask. And now I need to brush some of it out. It's pure white right now. I want to brush some black texture onto it. So I'm going to switch to my brush tool, B on the keyboard. Then I'm going to scale my brush down just a little bit and make sure that I'm painting black instead of white because I want to paint out pixels, not put them back in. But if I click and drag now, you can see just how quickly that is going to actually remove my text and make it completely unreadable. So instead of doing it like this, I want to reverse my process. I'm going to undo Command Option Z until I've undone all of those brush strokes. And I want to instead make my mask black and paint the text back in using this textured brush. So with black being my foreground color, I want to fill my layer mask. Because it is selected, I can just press Option or Alt and the delete key, and that will fill the mask with black. If I didn't have that mask selected, if I had the text layer selected, it would not have worked that way. So make sure that your layer mask is selected before you try to fill it. All right, now that that's done, I'm going to switch to white being my foreground color, press B on the keyboard to get back to my brush, and then start clicking a bunch to paint back in my text. And I am clicking a lot here. My flow is very low, so it really can take a lot of work to get this back to where it should be. But let's say right about there is where I want it. I think that's pretty good. Now there's some texture to that image, and it is semi-transparent, so it is showing through to the background, but I think that kind of grungy look is actually pretty good. Now let's say that I overdid it right here. Let's say that all of this P and the A and the M is just a little bit too solid. Well, instead of having to undo, I could just switch from painting the white onto my layer mask and switch it back to black to removing the texture or removing the solid portions of that layer mask. So if I press X on the keyboard to swap back to my black, I can just start painting that out again, press X again, bring some of it back in, and just continue this until I've got something that I'm happy with. So let's go ahead and get rid of a lot of that and then bring some of it back in. And it looks like just clicking a whole bunch is really going to bring that texture back. Now that might seem like kind of a crazy process of being able to do that, but just clicking a lot and moving your brush around can really add some random generated texture to it. You could also try turning your flow up a little bit so it's adding more texture for every click, but I think that actually worked pretty well for this particular piece. All right, now we definitely still have a ways to go. I would never send this off to my creative director as it is, because as it stands, this guy doesn't really look like he's part of this scene, and the jar kind of still looks like it's just floating there. I really want this all to feel like one cohesive piece and like it was one design that was meant to be together. And you know, the skin tone and the overall editing of this stock photo is pretty blue, whereas the background of my image is pretty warm. So we're going to want to deal with those kind of things before I send this off. But I'm going to stop right here because I realize we just ventured into Photoshop and we covered a whole lot of ground. It was a lot to take in. So for now, I'm just going to take a break. We're going to stop here and I'll pick up where I left off in the next lesson.